I'm painting this picture of my coffee pot in my visual diary. So this is basically just a diary of things I see every day. And I finally realized like, wow, I've never done my coffee pot. So after I drew it, I'm painting it over with opera pink. This is gouache. It's in a Stillman and Birn Zeta sketchbook. I'm doing a pretty thin coat, pretty watered down, so that when it dries, it won't bleed through too much when I start to put more gouache on top. And I don't need this to be perfect. I just want to get some of that color so it'll show through. Because when I start to paint the coffee pot, it's a lot of really cool colors. You know, it's a lot of grays and blues in the reflection. And I thought that by having this opera pink underneath, it would really sort of pop. One thing to keep in mind about opera pink is it's what's called a fugitive color, which means that it's not real light resistant. It can fade in the light. This is in my sketchbook, so it doesn't so much matter. And illustrators use a color like opera pink because they know they're going to scan it. It's not really going to, the original painting isn't really going to spend a lot of time in the light. So once that's completely dry, I can put down a slightly thicker coat of gouache, and the two colors don't really mingle with each other that much. And I just get these little hints of that opera pink showing through. So I'm starting out with a bunch of grays. What you can see from my gouache palette is that I use a dinner plate to mix on. You just go to the thrift store, buy a big white dinner plate. And there's always some dried gouache left on the plate from last time. And what I do is I just rinse it off to get the big puddles of dried paint off. But I don't actually mind that there's these little bits of old paint still stuck to the palette. It's kind of nice to just have a variety of things on the palette that I can mix into just to make the colors a little more dynamic. So that's what I do. If you haven't used gouache a lot, when it's dry, you can re-wet it and paint with that. It's just that it will always be very watery and you won't get that wonderful creamy texture that you get right out of the tube. So let me tell you some of the colors I'm using. I'm using ivory black, and that happens to be an M. Graham color, but there's no particular reason for that. It's just a black. I'm using a couple of grays from Holbein, and I don't really use these a lot, but I just had them from a time I took a workshop and they were on the supply list, so I thought I'd go ahead and use them. I'm using a gray number 1, which is just a very light gray. And I'm also trying out a little bit of ash blue, which is a bluish gray, and those are both from Holbein. I also have some white, obviously. I use permanent white or titanium white. And then I did add a little bit of blue to my palette. So these are also Holbein colors. I put down a little bit of cobalt turquoise and a little bit of aqua blue. Those are two colors I use a lot, actually. And they're great mixing colors as well as just, straight out of the tube. So I've gotten some grays down for the stainless steel. I can sort of come back and work on those some more. What I thought I would do next is get the reflections on the glass. And they're pretty bluish reflections. So I'm going to try to just sort of put those down first, in part because I'm about to cover my palette in a whole bunch of different grays. And so I thought, well, I should get these really clean, clear blues down first, and then I'll start in on those, on the rest of the reflections in the glass. But the next thing I want to do is go ahead and get the rest of the coffee pot. So like the, behind the pot itself, the rest of the coffee maker, and just sort of get a lot of that in. And a lot of that really is deep, dark black, which I hope is what's going to make the coffee pot itself sort of stand out and make it, a little more obvious that it's glass and that this is sort of background color. So I'm just sort of, I'm working from a photograph here, and I'm just sort of looking and trying to observe where I see the very blackest black with not even a hint of gray, and go ahead and get all of that in. Now keep in mind, this is just for my sketchbook, so this is kind of just for fun. I don't really need this to be absolutely perfect. I mean, this is a project that the total time of the video was 40 minutes. including a couple of like quick little breaks to go find other paint colors and stuff I needed. So this isn't something that took me a ton of time, and I don't want it to be really overworked. I just want to sort of get the impression of like, here's this object that I look at every day, and that's pretty important to me. It's my morning coffee. So another thing is I'm not too worried about painting over my pencil marks. Like up in the stainless steel area, I had drawn little pencil lines for every different button on the coffee maker. And I've covered all that up now. I can't see it anymore. I think it's still worth drawing just to sort of think through where those things are, but I'm not worried about that. I know I'll be able to put those back in. So in terms of the drawing, I'm not trying to leave anything light enough so that I can keep using that to guide me, as helpful as it is to have in the beginning. Now, one thing I'm going to say about doing the glass here is it's easy to get way too intimidated when you're trying to do like reflections on glass or reflections on water. I mean, it can get very, very technical. And so my big piece of advice is take breaks, walk away, go look at something else. And probably when you come back and look at it again, you'll realize like, oh, this is actually better than I thought it was. And probably once the whole painting is done, nobody's going to focus on this one thing so much. And within the context of the rest of the painting, it's actually going to look pretty good. So don't stress yourself out too much about it. Don't overwork it. Try to trust the marks that you put down at first and move on to the rest of the painting before you start to think, oh my goodness, I can really see that I need to do more here. So just give yourself a little bit of grace, I guess I would say, and don't freak out. Like at this stage of the painting, I'm looking at this glass going, this looks terrible. This doesn't look like glass at all. But I'm also sort of reminding myself, like, I haven't even put the background in yet. I can always come back and do more details. One of the wonderful things about gouache is that you can kind of keep layering on top. You have to be careful of how much water you have in your mix. If I were to put a real watery mix on top of all this paint I've put down, it would all kind of blend together and you can end up with sort of a gray, muddy mess. So it is true that you got to think in terms of like thin, watery washes underneath and then thicker, creamier washes brush strokes on top. So I am sort of aware of that. Mostly I'm trying to really look at what I'm painting and think, okay, so this is the lid. Like, let me really try to convey, the lid that sits on this coffee pot. And, let me make sure I'm really thoughtful about like, here's the handle. So I'm just kind of working back and forth, just little brush strokes here and there to try to make that a little bit more realistic, but at some point, I'll want to think about getting that background in, and I think it'll really sort of help the image. So I'm looking for other places where I see reflections, like the counter that it's sitting on kind of reflects up onto the black plastic of the base. I want to get little lines in for that. Just trying to find other little places where I can see little telling kind of reflections or lines that will help make this look more like what it is. The background of the coffee maker itself shows through the handle there. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at. Doing a little bit more color mixing. The counter and everything else in the room is reflecting on the glass of the coffee pot as well. So I'm just sort of working back and forth and trying to find ways to like make all of that kind of clear without, overworking it a ton. And this is just sort of this is really just sort of a process of really trusting what you see and also really paying attention to making sure that your darks are as dark as possible and that your lights are as light as they need to be. So that's a big part of this is like, I've got this black out and I really want to, put that black back in wherever I think, it needs to be in order for this to look like glass that's sitting in a machine that's basically completely black. Okay, so the coffee pot is pretty much together. Now I'm going to put a bunch more white down on my palette. Another thing I could say about the palette is I tend to just put little bits of paint out at a time because I'm not trying to seal this palette up when I'm done and kind of save all this paint. So I tend to just put little bits out at a time and keep working. If I were doing a much bigger painting, then obviously I would need to have a bunch more paint out on the palette, but this is just kind of how I do it. So the countertop has kind of a warm color on it, just from the way the light bounces around in the kitchen. And that's actually kind of nice because it's helpful if the countertop is one color and the background is another color. It just sort of helps set them apart. And as it is, this has got a lot of warm light on it from the more kind of incandescent light bulb that's shining down on it. But then behind it is some white tiles that are in the shade. So I'm really thinking about like these tiles, they're white, but they look pretty bluish because they're in shadow. So I'm hoping that the sense of that will come through, that it'll be sort of obvious that like these aren't actually gray tiles. It's just that's that's kind of the look of it. And you can see, even though I am using a pretty opaque white, I'm using this permanent white, you can see how much of that opera pink comes through the color of the tile. And I really like that. Like the pink is sort of unifying the whole thing. And the amount of it that shows through is somewhat just an accident. As I paint, I'm covering some of it up and I'm leaving some of it uncovered. And it's actually not super deliberate. It's just sort of like, this is how this is working out. So I'm trying to get, a pretty unified sense of the colors of the tiles. And then I'll come and I'll kind of redraw those lines so it's obvious that it's like, kitchen tile. But for the moment, it's more about making sure that there's a lot of variety and also a sense of these being white tiles in a shadow. So after the gouache is dry, a layer, you can come in and put another layer on top if you want it to be less transparent, right? So if you put a layer down that's pretty transparent and there's too much of something coming through, then it's really a matter of like, make sure it's good and dry first. And once it is, you can keep building up another layer or two and till you get it to where you want it. And in my case, I did want a sense of that pink showing through just a little bit. So I'm going to put 2 layers down and call that good. And now I just want to show like the grout, and make it obvious that there's like a tile pattern back here. And the tricky thing with tiles like this is you really do kind of have to look and, ask yourself like, well, what really happens with the light? Because the tile curves a little bit. And so there's this dark, it's in part because of the shadow and in part just because the grout is a slightly different color. This dark color, but then there's also a lighter part of the tile right next to that where it kind of curves in and there's a little reflection of it catching the light. So I'm just sort of cleaning up some edges here as I go. I decided I didn't really like that tile pattern the way I painted it. And I'll come back in now. I've got a very small brush here. This is a number 2. And I'm just adding that kind of the white, which is right next to where the darker shadow is. And it's one of those things, this happens a lot actually, where you have a shadow on something and sometimes there's a white highlight right next to where the shadow is. It's always a good thing to look at because it can make it look a little more realistic and give it a sense of depth. Even for something like this, that's, again, this is like just a super quick, casual sketchbook kind of painting, but I still want, to have thought it through and to have tried to get, to try to get it kind of as accurate as I want it to be for what I'm doing. So now that that's done, it's basically just little bits of cleanup. So I'm just looking at the edges of things to ask myself, is there anything that I want to just straighten out a little bit? any place where I want to add some darker values or some lighter values. This is what painters sometimes call the bling layer, where you're going around and you're just looking to add little bits of dark or little bits of light that you think will really make the whole thing kind of come to life right at the last minute and make it sort of, make sense. So I've got all that. Now I need just a little bit of super creamy black for some of the edges here in the coffee pot, and just kind of showing the lid of it and really making sure that all of that's kind of clear and that it's just obvious what all that is. So I'm just sort of messing around here, just going back and forth. This is kind of my last chance to do this. So one thing that I do like to do at this stage is to stop and take a picture. So when you feel like, I think I'm kind of done, but I'm not sure, I'm not completely satisfied, if you take a picture and then walk away, and look at your phone, crop it, make it look kind of nice, usually you will instantly see the thing that's wrong with it. So it's a great way to just kind of check yourself. It also helps to stand back, but in a small sketchbook like this, sometimes standing back doesn't really give you all the information you want. So that's why the picture can be really helpful. So I'm getting to where I feel more satisfied with the reflections in this. And now that it's kind of sitting on the counter, it looks more obvious, I think, what this is. And so people will just sort of glance at it and go, oh yeah, coffee pot, of course, I get it, I see it. Totally makes sense. So I still need to, I'm just going to darken up a little bit in the background there, just kind of the rim around the metal part. That's actually a piece of metal right there. It doesn't really look like one. And then also I want to put in the buttons. So now I'm going back and I'm really just kind of eyeballing this, and I don't need any of this to be perfect. It's a coffee pot. There's some buttons on it. It does not have to be hyper realistic, but I do want to kind of follow the pattern that I see there. So I'm going to put these buttons in, just a few little finishing touches, and this will be done. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, feel free to like this and subscribe to the channel. But also, I do send out art tutorials once a week. You get them in your inbox. And that's something you can subscribe to that I'm going to put in the notes below. So please check that out if you're interested and you want more of anything and everything that you can do in a sketchbook. And I would be happy to send that to you. So this thing's looking pretty good. There's a few little kind of red lights that light up on the coffee pot, so I'm dropping those in. I don't want them to be too bright, but fortunately they sort of mix with that gray a little bit, and that kind of takes care of it. And then also there's a power cord. So I'm just going to put that in, and once I've got that, I'm feeling pretty good about this. I think it's just about done. So I hope this was fun for you, and definitely, draw things in your everyday life. It's a great way to keep a visual diary of everything you see in your world. Thanks very much.